Hello, my name is Lawrence Tavera, and this video is for the substitute teacher that is going to be overseeing my class for today's lesson on natural selection. So, at this point in the semester, we have already gone over our unit for life at the smallest level. So, we've talked about the building blocks of life. We've talked about how living things are made out of cells, and within those cells, living organisms undergo protein synthesis. So they have DNA, they transcribe the DNA into RNA, and then they translate that RNA into proteins, and then those proteins are what give the cell its traits and ultimately give an organism the various different traits that it has, right? So they learned about phenotypes and genotypes, and they've already learned about traits in organisms. So in today's lesson, we're going to be learning about natural selection. So when students come and sit down in class, they already know that they need to pull out their laptops and they need to answer today's entry question on Padlet, our assessment question. So our assessment question is what makes all of these animals similar to each other. So you, the substitute teacher, can also go to Padlet. I have it linked in the lesson plan, so I'll just show it over here. And students can post by clicking this plus button down here. I usually have them put their name, and then I usually have them write their answers over here. And you can, in real time, have the students, look at the students' answers. So for the first 5 minutes of class, you should be sort of going over what the students' answers are, so the students could have any number of, could talk about any number of things, such as these animals are hiding, right? And then you could sort of prompt them to ask, like, well, what are they hiding from, or why are they hiding, right? And so, to connect all of these dots together, all of these animals have this trait, and this trait is used for hiding. So for example, for foxes and cheetahs, those animals have fur that allows them to blend in. For insects, they actually change their body's morphology to mimic something else in the background, such as this cicada. Other animals will look like other animals, such as this seahorse looking like a coral, and other animals will actually change their bodies to look more physically similar, right? I think I've already mentioned that. So throughout history, to segue into our next slide, humans have observed that animals come in all different shapes and sizes, all have different traits, and all these different traits are used for different things. So at least scientists hypothesize that, well, eagles fly and they use this flight for catching fish. You could talk about how roses, for example, have thorns, and that helps them fight against predators that will eat them. And some animals have traits that let them survive the environment that they live in. For example, the squirrel surviving in the cold. So scientists have asked themselves, why do we see some traits and not others? And that's a great way to segue into this slide, right? So you could ask students, could eagles eat fish if they couldn't fly over lakes, for example? Or what would happen if this rose didn't have thorns? Or what happens if you shave the fur off of a squirrel? Would it survive in the winter? So scientists have hypothesized that, well, they have these traits because they help other animals survive, right? And that sort of process is what led Darwin and others to theorize that there is a force at work that does this, and that force is natural selection. So at this point, you need to tell the students that they need to write down this definition in their notes. So they need to write down that natural selection is a process by which organisms are better adapted to their environment to successfully produce offspring, right? So the big thing here is that natural selection is a force of nature. You need to emphasize this to the students, right? So you need to emphasize that natural selection that you should, or rather that you should have students think of natural selection in the same vein as like the sun shining, or like why water is wet, or why the wind blows, because there's nothing that is influencing. There's no outside force that is influencing what animals have which traits. It sort of just happens, right? And so the first misconception that I want to address about natural selection is that it's survival of the fittest. So students need to write down this definition for fitness. So it's an organism's ability to pass its genetic material, right? So the material in its nucleus, the material in the cells, that genetic material to its offspring. So the traits that persist in the environment are not all about survival. Survival is a means to an end. That you need to emphasize that to the students. Right? So you need to emphasize reproduction, right? Survival is a means to reproduction. So an animal can have a trait that lets them survive for a very, very long time. You know, turtles can live up to 100 years old or more. However, if the animal is not able to reproduce, then that trait is going to disappear as soon as that animal dies. Because all animals, all living beings, eventually die. Right? And so natural selection shows us which traits will persist in the environment. Right? So bigger, faster, smarter, stronger. It doesn't matter in the end if the animal doesn't reproduce. Right? That's what you need to emphasize to the students. So again, another common misconception comes from animals, or rather that animals are trying to get traits. Like a polar bear thinks, oh, you know what would be great in this cold environment? A fur coat. Let me grow a fur coat. No, that is not what is happening, all right? So you need to emphasize that animals are born with traits that they inherit. And if those traits help them reproduce, then that trait will proliferate or become more prevalent in the environment. Animals do not think to get traits. All right, remember that you need to hammer that natural selection is a force of nature. All right. So today's activity that we're going to be doing to show how natural selection works is going to be a case study about a group of mice in the desert. Right? So today's activity is going to be on rock pocket mice. And so at this point, the students already know to grab the worksheet from the table set out next to the door on their way in. And so with that paper in hand, the desks should already be set up with the material for that day's lab. So in that case, that material is going to be these cards that I'm going to print out and laminate so that we can use them for multiple classes. And they're going to be organizing their cards and creating a hypothesis as to why these animals are in these spots changing over time, right? And so to help them answer the question, right, I print out the sentence starters for students. So these laminated cards are usually I will put them in like small little pencil case holders at the desks for the students. And so for our English language learners, we want to help them sort of join clauses together. They do this because, or this is evidence that, this happens because, or this is shown by this. All right. And so after they answer the first 3 questions, that should take them about 5 minutes. We're going to play this 10-minute and 30-second video on natural selection. And so after that video plays, you tell the students to answer questions 7 through 10, or sorry, 4 through 10, rather. So that's just the directions, moving around the those laminated papers. And then with the sentence starters or without them, right? So some students don't need them, or some students would want to explain what their thoughts in different ways. So you shouldn't pressure them into using those sentence starters, but it should definitely help them. Explain why sorry, write down the answers to these questions up to number 9. So for number 10, this is going to be our assessment, our mid-lesson assessment. So the students are going to answer questions for whether or not the process is random, right? And this includes some bonus questions. This is to help those students who are more advanced and to give them deeper thinking, get them to think deeper about our lesson, to synthesize what we learned from a prior lesson about protein synthesis, and then to think about other animals in the environment, to think about their traits and how traits between animals interact with each other. And so students will already know to get into groups when you tell them to. They have their groups of 4 based on the desk's arrangement. And they will collaborate, and then on their whiteboards that they have at their desks, they're going to write down their answer. And so you can assess what they have and address any concerns that you might have based on any misconceptions. So it is not random, because traits that are more beneficial will persist throughout the environment across subsequent generations, right? That's what natural selection is. So after you talk to this group of students about that and answer that question in that way, you can move on to talking about the conditions for natural selection. So that's variation, competition, and inheritance. Right? So another misconception is that there is something giving an animal traits. There is nothing that is giving the animal traits. They hit upon this in the video, but traits arise from random mutations, right? That is random, but natural selection is not random. All right, so going over these 4 should take you about 5 minutes. So the homework the students have, they're going to have to know how to define natural selection. They're going to know those conditions for natural selection to occur and be able to explain how that trait is selected for. And then finally, students will also answer on Padlet for tomorrow's lesson as well for these questions. So I hope that you have a good time in my classroom, and thank you for substituting for my classroom.